Hello, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk to you guys about the best books that I read in 2020. So this year was an interesting year for me in terms of reading. I ended up reading, I think, 215 books, and despite reading such a large volume, I didn't end up having quite as many favorites as I usually do when I read, and that was a little disappointing. But whenever I was kind of putting this list together, I realized that there were some themes that kind of carried on through the books that I really liked. 2020 was obviously kind of a bleak year, so for me, the things that really got me through were books that just brought me uninhibited joy. I think some books that I read in prior years, you know, they really pulled on my emotions in other ways, but this year the books that are on this list really just brought me so much joy, and some of these books too really introduced me to new genres. So there's a lot of stuff on here that I think you won't expect. There are 6 books that I'm going to talk to you guys about, and then some honorable mentions that I'll include at the end. Let's get into the 6 books that I absolutely loved this year. So the first book on this list is really representative of a new genre for me, a new love of a genre, and that is thrillers, and the book is Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. I adored this book. I thought it was so much fun, and it did kind of bring me this uninhibited joy as well. Well, I did read a few thrillers in 2019. I think 2020 was really the year that I figured out what I really enjoy in thrillers and what I don't enjoy, and this really represented what I enjoy in thrillers, which is not that typical domestic thriller where you've got a man who cheats on his wife or vice versa. You have something kind of different and that provides a little bit of social commentary. The story, for context, is about our heroine Jules, and she is tasked with being an apartment sitter at this kind of historic building that no one knows a whole lot about. In exchange for being paid under the table, Jules has to kind of abide by these sort of strict list of rules. The rules essentially say that Jules will not ask questions about what goes on in the building, she won't find out more about the tenants, and she can't tell anyone that she has this job. This isn't too much of an ask for Jules because she doesn't really have a family to speak of, but after a series of unfortunate events unfolds at this apartment complex, she is desperate to know more about what has happened and what is really going on kind of behind closed doors. The reveal of this book is still probably my favorite reveal that I have read ever in a thriller. It doesn't rely on cheap plot twists or unguessable things that kind of come in at the last second. It is just this beautiful culmination of plot, and it kind of takes you by surprise. I think overall I just really appreciated what this book did in terms of social commentary and also being something that kept me on the edge of my seat the entire time I was reading. I just really liked this, and I have kind of enjoyed most of Riley Sager's backlist after reading this book, so I hope that I see more thrillers like this going into 2021. I'm excited to kind of explore more in the genre and find out even more about what my preferences are, but this book really took me by surprise, and it was something that just to this day thinking about it makes me smile, so love this book. The second book on my list is definitely one that is uncharacteristic of my tastes because I don't really like science fiction and I don't read a ton of YA anymore, but the second book on my list is Skyward by Brandon Sanderson. This is young adult sci-fi about our main character named Spensa, and she lives trapped with a bunch of other humans on this planet that is being constantly attacked by aliens that no one else on the planet kind of like knows about. They know nothing about these aliens, they just know that they have to protect themselves. The story kind of opens up and we're told that Spensa has always dreamed of being a fighter pilot. She wants to fight the aliens head on, and we also find out that Spensa's dad was someone who was a deserter, and this leaves her in a kind of uncomfortable position. Her family has kind of been shamed and shunned in the society, but Spensa is determined to make it into the next flight class. So the story is about her kind of fighting tooth and nail to take this test, get into this flight class, and about what it means to fight aliens, I guess. So much about this worked for me. I liked that Spensa had this sense of honor and duty, I guess, to kind of carry on her family legacy, to figure out why her father was a deserter and if he was actually indeed a deserter. I liked the focus on teamwork, I guess. There are a lot of scenes where you get Spensa training with the other people in her flight class, which I thought was super fun to read about. I'm really into like team sports in stories, so this really worked for me. And while initially Spensa's character kind of irritated me, I liked her development throughout the story. She kind of is a little bit bold and a little bit rash at the beginning of the story, but as things kind of unfold and as she grows as a character, we see her being a little bit more introspective and ask the like right questions. I don't know, it was really fascinating to see her growth, and I really actually ended up caring about her a lot. It made me really want to pick up the sequel. Oh, and lastly, I have a very specific love of AI in stories and AI that interacts with characters in the book. This was definitely something that happened in Skyward, which really like scratched an itch I didn't know that I had. And overall, I don't know, the story was just so triumphant to me, and it's just so rare for me nowadays to get fully immersed in a story and fully invested in what's going on. But this story really gripped me and I could not let go until the very end. So I really liked this book. I think if you are interested interested at all in the plot, I would pick this up. Again, this is not something I normally would have picked up. I really hate space stories. I don't like science fiction. I don't read a ton of YA anymore, but something about this just worked and I adored it. Speaking of itches being scratched, I have the ultimate scratch. Dear Ava by Ilsa Madden Mills. This book was everything to me, and it wasn't really until nearly 6 months later that I could really articulate and pinpoint what about this book stood out to me from all of the other new adult romances that I read this year. I, my friends, am world's #1 biggest fan of mutual pining. This book was chock full of it, and in reading other stories this year, I really pinpointed and figured out that mutual pining is something that is kind of foolproof for getting me to enjoy a romance. Call it miscommunication, call it what you will, but two characters who secretly love each other and are just too scared or think that they're not good enough for the other person, it just always works for me. Grade A good shit. So this book is primarily a new adult story centering around our characters who are in their senior year of high school and are trying to figure some things out. Our heroine Ava is coming back to school for her senior year in hopes that she can figure out who drugged and assaulted her at a party her junior year. And in trying to figure out who assaulted her, she gets close with this jock named Knox who was also at the party that night. She doesn't know if Knox had anything to do with it, but she's hoping that Knox will team up with her and kind of help her figure out who did it, and he is a willing participant. He definitely has a lot invested in this and really wants to help Ava figure out who hurt her. The story is really heavy, but it does a really good job at balancing the seriousness of what has happened to Ava with a really, really sweet romance. I will say this book definitely has faults, and I think you can attribute a lot of that to the fact that this is a new adult romance. There is a lot of bullying that occurs that is questioned definitely, but I think is probably less typical of something that would actually happen in real life. However, I think I was able to overlook that because our hero definitely fights against a lot of the bullying that occurs to his heroine or like to his love interest, and I just think overall the sweetness of the story kind of makes up for whatever pitfalls happen in regard to bullying. Also, I really appreciated the ending of this story. I think too often in new adult stories and in romance in general, things wrap up a little bit too neatly, but in this story you really get the characters having to work through some of the shit that's happened to them, and I really appreciated the realism that added to an otherwise kind of saccharine story. In my opinion, the story is a total hidden gem, and I think it's one that I probably would have overlooked had I just been going based on cover alone. The cover model is obviously 30, but the story is definitely centered on a younger demographic. It was kind of a weird thing to like see the cover and read the description, but I'm glad that I ended up picking this one up. And in a lot of ways, I think this story really showed me that I'm kind of shying away from bully romances and things that are a little bit harsher. I'm really more into kind of mutual pining and sweetness in my stories. My tastes are changing, which I think is always fun to discover. So this book might come as a bit of a surprise for anyone who religiously watches my channel because I've never talked about it in a video before. This book really just punched my 2-month reading slump in the throat, and that book is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This is another book that I don't think I can adequately pinpoint what about it specifically really worked for me, but I think the harmony of the plot and the social commentary just came together in such a way that I was so impressed and then just so invested in the story that happened that immediately after finishing, I got into another book slump and was just dying for the sequel. So the story is about our main character, Alex Stern, as she is taken from a crime scene in LA and offered a spot at Yale. We don't know the circumstances surrounding Alex's life initially, or why she is specifically picked to go to Yale, but we do quickly get to learn about the job that she has to do at Yale, and it is lovely and brutal. Essentially, Alex is thrust into this world of secret societies and is asked to be an apprentice to a magical cop. A guy named Darlington essentially teaches her how to preside over these secret societies to ensure that they don't do unhinged things that affect other people on the Yale campus. And in doing so, she starts to kind of discover some seedier things, some darker things that are occurring that aren't on the surface level of these secret societies. The societies as a whole are kind of doing shady shit, but they're doing even more shady shit than we first come to realize. While this story was kind of slow moving at times, and I wasn't entirely sure if I was going to be invested in Alex as a character, after I kind of understood the direction of the story, I started to really appreciate the way the story was being told and in what Leigh Bardugo was trying to say. This book does such a good job at balancing a really thought out world and magic with the inherent privilege and disregard for human life that occurs in places like this. And to top that off, I think Alex does such a good job at kind of grappling with the things that are happening to her and growing as a character as the story goes on. Her growth is definitely something that's a little more subtle than I see in other stories, but by the end of the story, I was rooting for her and was so excited as she was kind of figuring out the privilege and kind of the layers to that privilege that some of the other people in the story were utilizing and abusing. Overall, the atmosphere, the characters, the story, just everything came together and worked so flawlessly, and I could not be more excited to see where Leigh goes with this story. I'm dying for the sequel, and overall this was just like a perfect fall read for me. So this next book is definitely an example of my growing love for middle grade, and that book is King and Dragonflies by Kaysen Callender. So I only read a few middle grade books in 2020, but the ones that I did read left a really lasting impact on me and really showed me how transcendent of targeted age group that these books can really be. So this story is about our main character King, who is dealing with the recent death of his brother and the words that his brother left him with right before he died. His brother told him that he shouldn't be hanging out with his best friend Sandy because people will think that he is gay like Sandy. So King is dealing with the loss of his brother, grappling with the words that his brother left him with, and he's also trying to be there for his friend while also figuring out his own place in the world. Everything about this book really worked for me. The lush southern setting, the focus on friendship, and the fight against societal pressures. This book never felt preachy, but it definitely delivered a message that I think almost anyone can benefit from reading. And it's one that after reading, I still constantly think about. This book also definitely cemented Kacen Callender as one of my new favorite authors. I really, really like his books, and it was really hard picking between this book and another book for my best of list. And then lastly, we have my favorite book of the year. None of these other books were in any particular order, but this one definitely has a top spot as my favorite romance of the year, and that is Take a Hint, Danny Brown by Talia Hibbert. The story is about our heroine Danny, who is a PhD student, and one day during a fire drill, she gets stuck in an elevator and is rescued by one of her friends who works the front desk at the university, Zaf, and he fireman carries her out of the building. After this fireman's carry style rescue, a lot of attention is put on both characters on social media, and they're using the social media fame to their advantage. Zaf has a charity that he's trying to get attention onto, and Zaf and Danny come together and fake date so that Zaf will raise money for his charity. But obviously, fake dating leads to real feelings, and what great feelings they were. This book really hit every box for me. You've got the grumpy hero who worships the ground that the heroine walks on. You've got a heroine who is a boss bitch who is scared to be in love. You've got lots of time spent together, hilarious banter, amazing internal dialogue, real people with real bodies, real mental health issues, and sex positivity and swoon-worthy content galore. I honestly could not love this book more if I tried. It has really solidified itself as my favorite traditionally published contemporary romance. I thought for a long time that nothing was going to top The Hating Game for me, but after recently rereading The Hating Game after reading this book, Take a Hint, Danny Brown is much better, and I'm just so impressed with the story and so glad that I picked it up this year. So those are my top 6, but I thought I would throw in a couple of honorable mentions in case you guys wanted some more books to check out this year. First, we have Edenbrook by Julian Donaldson. This is a smut-free historical romance that I really fell in love with. It really gave me Pride and Prejudice meets Anne of Green Gables vibes. It gave me a lot of whimsy, a lot of charm, and just the right amount of miscommunication. The next two are series, and I'm just going to put them both up on the screen. We have the Hidden Legacy series by Ilona Andrews and the Winston Brothers series by Penny Reed. I think these just sort of told me that I need to read a more romance series. I love having the familiarity of a series to go home to. There's just something nice about reading the first book and then knowing there's like 7 other books in the series that you can carry on with, and that was definitely evidenced in these 2 series. One's contemporary, one is more of a paranormal situation. Both are equally fantastic, and I would highly recommend you pick them up. Next up is Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. This is one that I just read at the exact right time, and I think it's a really touching story. I think if you're not really into feel-good emotional stories, this might not be for you, but this was a story that really worked for me. Next up, we have Felix Ever After by Kacen Callender. I adored this book. This was one that was kind of battling King and the Dragonflies for one of the top spots on my favorite books of the year. This one was so good. I loved how messy, how real, how raw it was, and I loved seeing our main character kind of figure out his identity throughout the story. Next up is a super impactful queer middle grade story that almost made it on the list because it did make me cry, and that is Ivy Aberdeen's Letter to the World by Ashley Herring Blake. This was just so heartwarming. It dealt with a lot of important issues, and I would not hesitate to recommend this to people. Next up is another thriller that really impacted me. This is definitely not a jump scare type of thriller, but it is one that really hit hard, and it was The Good Daughter by Karen Slaughter. This doesn't have any like twisty reveals, but I think if you want something that has a little bit more of a message to it almost, or really focuses on sibling relationships, I think you'll really enjoy this. The next book on my list is Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. This is one that really punched me in the guts and really got me to explore grief and about what death means, and I don't know, it's not something that I've ever really read in a story that impacted me quite like this one did, so highly recommend this one. Next up, we have The Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan. I loved this book. There's not much else to say about it. This is not my first time reading it, but this is the first time that I think the story really gripped me and just showed me true joy. I mean, I almost put this on my list, not because it was like the best book that I have read this year, but because when I was reading this, I was just so happy the entire time reading it. And I think if you haven't picked the story up, I think it's one that you definitely need to, especially in the summer. I think it gives you kind of throwback summer camp vibes. It just is excellent. Pick it up. Next up is another romance that almost made my top spot because I have never read a romance quite like this before. It's Hold Me by Courtney Milan. I love the diversity of the characters. I like that we had a trans heroine and a bisexual hero. I just loved the whole enemies to lovers situation. It felt very intelligent. It felt very smart, and I liked that both of our characters were in science and could kind of understand each other on that level. It was just super cool to see 2 people like fully in their element and fully get to like geek out with each other. Love this romance, highly recommend. And the last book on this list is one that is kind of a wild card. It's Wilder Girls by Rory Power. I really enjoyed this book. I think this one didn't show me anything necessarily new about my reading tastes, but it definitely showed me that I need to pick up more weird books, I guess. This one is super strange. It doesn't have a clear-cut ending, and it is sort of a dystopian, which I'm normally not into, but really worked for me in this book. And it kind of made me want to pick up more books with body horror. I don't know exactly how to pinpoint what I loved about this book, but I liked that you're just kind of thrust into the action of the story, and and I think if the synopsis sounds even remotely interesting to you, you should pick this book up. So those are all the books that I read in 2020 that I absolutely adored. You'll be seeing a most disappointing and a worst books list coming because, you know, I had to do both. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments down below what your best book of 2020 was, because I'd love to know, maybe add it to my TBR for 2021. But I love you guys so much. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time.